we now sort of put together some idea of a metric, a measuring stick that we can use to figure out how good this market is, and we're going to put it together now in the marketplace. But before to do that, I have to introduce somebody new to our course. Okay, this person is. I'll introduce this person. Will be with us really for the remainder of the course, and this person we're going to call the Benevolent Dictator. Now, the Benevolent Dictator is just what it says. She's a dictator, but she's benevolent. She can do anything she wants. That's what dictators do. But what her goal is, she lives by this credo. The goal is to maximize social gain. And we're going to call that SG. And SG is equal to the sum of rents, of net surplus to all parties. So in this case, there's only two of us, consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Now, we can actually introduce the government later and say, well, suppose the government comes in and puts some taxes on there or imposes some constraints, then we'll have to add another part to it because we're sort of adding it up. So the government gets its money from you, taxpayers, and so we have to think about, again, how much of that action is going on. But right now, life is easy. Only consumers, only producers. So social gain is the sum of those two. And remember what we're doing. Last time we sort of had this little vision of social gain being the size of the pie. The size of the pie is the total size of gains that this market transaction, the existence of this market and its equilibrium, how much does it give to society? We're talking about, from the very beginning, resource allocation. And we talked about the fact that there's all sorts of ways resources could be allocated. The dictator could determine how to do it. The command and control could determine how to do it. We could have socialism. We could have communism. We're actually talking about something called the market. The market is going to handle our resource allocation decision. Who gets what? And what we need to do is to figure out, well, how good is this outcome? Or to do that again in our favorite little device, which is to build a graph. So let's start by putting up a nice demand and supply picture. We'll put price and quantity there. We'll put a demand curve here. We'll label this D0 and S0. And remember, the supply curve is really just the sum of the marginal costs of all the people who've been producing this product. Now, it may just be one. We can get later to thinking about a monopoly. But right now, the only market we've actually looked at is a competitive market. But we're still going to build this metric to measure up what's the sum of the marginal costs. And over here, this is really just essentially, this is a locus of points of what economists would call marginal willingness to pay, right? There's an individual standing here. This individual has marginal willingness to pay of $10. If the price went up to $10.05, the individual says, I'm not in this market anymore. Sorry. The total market sales would fall because this individual would no longer play in this sandbox. They're going to go someplace else at that higher price. If it was lower, the individual would stay there, smile on his or her face because now their consumer surplus will be going up. They would have paid 10, but if they can get it for 8, what a deal. On the other hand, we also have the producers, and at this point they have $2. I just made those numbers up because I've got the pen, but they look pretty reasonable on this graph right now. And let's think again about what our benevolent dictator is trying to maximize. The sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Now, the most important thing to understand is the benevolent dictator is blind to the individual. The benevolent dictator only wants to make the size of the pie larger. Benevolent dictator doesn't care if it all goes to consumers and none to producers, or all the producers and none to consumers. The bigger the pie, the better, unambiguously. If you can show me a pie of 10 and another system shows me a pie of 11, I'm always going to take the pie of 11. And again, you might say, wait a minute, but that system, pie of 11, may have all sorts of inequalities with it and all. Well, we can actually fix those inequalities. I'm not saying that people in Washington will do that, but you can go in with taxes and refund systems, welfare checks, all sorts of things to pass money back and forth to sort of balance it out if you don't like it. But the allocation system itself We just want the pie to be as big as possible. Come back with a sharp knife later and divide it up if you don't like it. Well, think about this. Let's call this unit of production alpha, just because it works for me. Suppose that the Benevolent Dictator says, well, why don't we just make alpha units? For the alpha unit, what is the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus? And you say, well, consumer surplus is the net of gain, net of price, and producer surplus is price net of cost, so you got to tell me some strike price. Answer is I really don't have to. Just think about this distance right here. This vertical gap is the key, okay? And suppose I were to tell you that if you're really worried about price, suppose I told you the price was $8. So if price is $8, the consumer surplus equals 10 minus 8, which is 2, and the producer surplus would equal 8 minus 2, which is 6. Let me pick a different arbitrary strike price. I mean, I'm the Benevolent Dictator. Suppose I pick a strike price of 4. If the strike price were 4, add alpha. So I should put here, make sure we're talking about add alpha. Add alpha. Consumer surplus would be 10 minus 4, which is 6. Producer surplus would be 4 minus 2, which is 2. The net, again, is 8. So you see, no matter where I pick the strike price, the total value is always the difference between this point, which we'll call X, and this point, which we'll call Y. The strike price determines who gets what share. The Benevolent Dictator doesn't care. The Benevolent Dictator just wants that $8 to go to the pie. As you can see, you could pick any price along that yellow line, any price along that yellow line, and the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus will always be the same. Now, the identity of who gets what will, of course, be different. Irrelevant to the Benevolent Dictator. Just make the pie bigger. If you don't like who gets what, go back with a sharp knife later. Larger pies unambiguously better than smaller pies. So what this tells us is that for an output level, well, at any output level you choose, pick any arbitrary output level along this axis, and the gap between consumers' willingness to pay and the producer's willingness to put them on the market, that gap is the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And so for each unit of production, this gap is growing the size of the pie. If the Benevolent Dictator were to say, stop, right here, that's all we want to produce is alpha. Well, that would be a bad outcome. The Benevolent Dictator would rethink this right away, and she would say, hey, wait a minute, alpha's not good. Let's continue to push to the right. As we push to the right, each one of these outputs is generating a value to consumers, the final users, in excess of the resources burned up. Remember, that's what marginal cost tells us. The resources burned up in the production of this product. And so each one of these vertical gaps will be in addition to the size of the pie. Once we get to this point, let's call this point here beta. At this output beta, if we go to the right one more unit, as the Benevolent Dictator says, put another one on the market, you can see that for this extra unit we put on the market, the cost to society for that extra unit exceed the value. The gap between consumers' willingness to pay and what resources burned up are is a negative number. What's happening to the size of the pie? Well, the size of the pie is getting smaller. If you were to push past this point, it's a very bad outcome. The size of the pie is getting smaller. And so the Benevolent Dictator, when she looks at a market like this, says, I know the outcome we ought to have. The outcome where the marginal willingness to pay, that's as read off the demand curve, is exactly equal to the marginal resource cost, the cost of production of things burned up on the margin. Again, that's why we're not really so interested in fixed costs here. We're talking about marginal cost. And so if the Benevolent Dictator were to look at a market that looked like this, with a demand curve here and a supply curve here, the Benevolent Dictator would say, I know exactly where I want to go. That's to this point, and we'll call this Q star social optimum. Now, at this point, let's step back and think about what did we just find when we did our competitive outcome? We found that for our competitive outcome, the equilibrium, the equilibrium in the competitive model was where the supply curve hits the demand curve. That is where the marginal resource cost equaled the marginal willingness to pay. There also was a price. Now that's irrelevant to the benevolent dictator. The benevolent dictator says, I want the resource allocation to be Q star sub social optimum. And one of the cool things about this is that under the restrictive conditions of our competitive model, remember we had some pretty restrictive conditions, the competitive model, left to its own devices, lots and lots and lots of independent little greedy firms just trying to maximize profits and independent consumers just trying to get the best deal they can, actually lands at the output that makes the pie as large as it possibly could get. There's no other outcome along this graph, none. Remember, it's really important that you get this. This is the sum of, this is what technology and nature tells you it costs to produce this product. I don't care if you're an oligopolist, I don't care if you're a monopolist, I don't care if you're a government manufacturer. Technology gives you a production function that tells you what it's going to cost to produce this. Consumers out there tell you how much they really value it. The benevolent dictator says, given that, whatever resource model you use, you better find this point. And if you find it, good. If the government regulator can do it, great. But the cool part is that the competitive equilibrium finds it. Now, the competitive equilibrium also does some other things that the benevolent dictator doesn't really care about, because the competitive equilibrium will also dictate that at that equilibrium, the consumer's share is that triangle, and producer's share is this triangle. The sum of those two add up to the biggest pie we can possibly get. That's why the benevolent dictator is over in the corner smiling. The benevolent dictator doesn't care who gets what. That's not part of what her goal is in this process, is just make the pie biggest. This outcome, society may come back later and say, well, really don't think like that too much. We're going to tax this group a little bit more heavily than this group to try and get these things equal. That's not the purview of this course.